Good morning. The scheduled meeting of the Senate State Government Committee will come to order, and will the Secretary please call the roll?
Senator Phillips-Hill.
Here.
Senator Collette. Here. Senator Corman.
Proxy.
Senator Gordner. Here. Senator Mastriano. Here. Senator Muth.
Proxy.
Senator Stefano.
Here.
Senator Judy Ward.
Proxy.
Senator Anthony Williams.
Here.
Senator Lindsey Williams. Here. And Senator Scarnati.
Proxy. A quorum having been established, we have 5 items on our agenda, and we're going to go a bit out of order from the agenda. So the first bill I'd like to call up is Senate Bill 417, sponsored by Senator Martin. Is there a motion to consider the bill? Moved by Senator Gordner, seconded by Senator Mastriano. Senate Bill 417 is now before the committee. This bill amends the Pennsylvania Election Code to change the number of write-in votes required to qualify as a winner of an election. The chair would like to recognize Senator Martin to say a few words on his bill. Thank you, Senator Martin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the members of the committee for being here today. Senate Bill 417 will require a write-in candidate in a general election to receive a minimum number of identical write-in votes equal to or greater than the minimum number of nomination petition signatures required for that office. This requirement is already in state law for primary elections. Just to give you an example, if the law currently requires you to have a minimum of 10 nomination petition signatures to appear on the ballot, then you would need at least 10 identical write-in votes to be eligible to win. To be open about the conversation, this isn't typically a problem we run into with some of our state level offices, countywide offices, but a lot of local municipal offices is where we tend to see a lot of individuals who win the election with one write-in. Sometimes end up having to flip a coin if 2 people had each of their names are in. I believe that's led to some issues across the entire Commonwealth with individuals who've gotten there who may not have had the qualifications for the job, which has led in some places to criminal charges or embezzlement of money, depending on what the positions are. And I think at a minimum, to treat all candidates equal across the board, that we should have the same expectations that the person running for that spot to begin with had to get 10 nomination petitions, or if they were written in the primary, they had to get 10 there as well, that these individuals would have to stand at their poll and convince 10 of their fellow citizens why they're qualified to be on the ballot. So that's the intent of the legislation, to match it up with what the primary requirement already is.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Are there any questions or discussions on the legislation?
Just a comment.
Senator Williams.
So you're saying you got a problem with Mickey Mouse? I don't quite get it.
As long as Mickey Mouse doesn't win the coin toss, and I think in some cases with some of the things that's happened across the Commonwealth, I wish Mickey would have won.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, are there any negative votes? Seeing none, hearing none, the ayes have it. And the bill as committed will now be reported to the full Senate for consideration. The next item I'd like to call up is Senate Resolution 179, also sponsored by Senator Martin. And is there a motion to consider the resolution? Moved by Senator Mastriano, seconded by Senator Stefano. Senate Resolution 179 is now before the committee, and this resolution urges Congress to make daylight savings time permanent in the United States. The chair again would like to recognize Senator Martin to say a few words on his resolution. Senator Martin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for general background, I'm sure a lot of folks have heard whenever we fall back or spring forward, we hear a lot of people griping. We actually all live it. We deal with our kids, our pets, who all get out of their cycles. But many people believe that this was created to actually help farmers, but it's actually a misconception. The practice began temporarily during World War I as a fuel-saving measure and was reinstated briefly during World War II, which was known as wartime. It was made a permanent fixture for most American states and territories in 1966 when President Johnson signed the Uniform Time Act. Some states and territories have opted out, and currently there are states that do not change their clocks back and forth. During the Arab oil embargo, President Nixon, through executive order and the Emergency Daylight Saving Time Energy Conservation Act of 1973, made daylight savings time permanent from January 1973 until April 1975, but it was then amended to end sooner in 1974. It's gone through a few other adjustments over the years, but according to the National Conference of State Legislators in 2019, 26 states were considering 46 different bills that have to go through the federal government, or resolutions related to changes associated with DST. For perspective, in 2015 through 2017, there were 16 states with bills introduced to get permission in order to do this. There have been, I could tell, to be fair, on both sides of the argument on the time changes, of which ones I hear a lot about the kids' safety in the mornings and whether or not it's dark. I think this really would help spark a conversation. There's a lot of discussion over the fact, and studies shown on that our kids are going to school too early to begin with. And there's a lot of schools across the Commonwealth, including some in my district, looking to go later in the morning starting next year. So it would go hand in hand with this. But the bigger thing no one ever thinks about, through all the frustration of the time changes, the health implications. In that time period of time changes, the risk of heart attack, stroke go up tremendously. And they also have studies that show a loss of $400 million in economic output because of those changes. So I just think it's a process that is well past its time. I think we can do better. And other states are already shown they can live with it without having to change the clocks back and forth 2 times a year.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Are there any questions or discussion on the bill? Senator Collette.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am really excited to see this, but I will say that as a former night shift nurse, I'm going to miss, well, I won't now, but those night shift nurses are going to miss getting paid that extra hour when we fall back, but I do appreciate you bringing this forward. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Senator Mastriano.
Thank you for this great initiative. I remember being on the Army Watch in Washington, D.C. and having an extra hour to work. That really sucked. So thanks for bringing us forth here. And it needs to go away. Thank you.
One important point I also wanted to mention is that the accident rates in the evenings, once we fall back and it's darker, when it starts to get dark around 3:40, go up tremendously during that period of time, and you have folks shuffling their kids to activities. And I think in general, from a family perspective, is who would not want to see a little more daylight when you get home from work and be able to do activities with your kids and potentially outdoors as well. So thank you for your consideration.
Chairman Williams.
Thank you. So you mentioned in your comments that some states have opted out. Yours is a resolution. Is there something that we need to do to move that process forward from our own state?
Yes, sir. They basically have to get approval from the federal government in order to do that. My personal belief is I wish the federal government would just approve it for everyone. And quite frankly, where you're from, to have one time in Philadelphia, but they go across the bridge to Camden, which a lot of people traverse back and forth. I could see that being problematic, but it's asking them to address this issue. We can ask for a single opt-out just of us, but this resolution's asking them to get rid of the practice in its entirety.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any further questions? Seeing none and no further discussion, are there any negative votes? Seeing none, hearing none, the ayes have it, and the resolution as committed will now be reported to the full Senate for consideration. Thank you very much, Senator Martin. The next item I'd like to call up is Senate Bill 779, sponsored by Senator Gordner. Is there a motion to consider the bill? Moved by Senator Gordner, seconded by Senator Mastriano. Senate Bill 779 is now before the committee, and this bill amends the Pennsylvania Election Code to change the date of the presidential primary election in the Commonwealth. The chair would like to recognize Senator Gordner to say a few words on his bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is not the first time the legislature has looked at this issue. I've been around for a while and actually went back to 98 and 99. When we looked at this issue, we actually authorized through a Senate resolution back in 1998 a task force to look at the issue through the Joint State Government Commission. They actually looked at a couple of issues. One was changing the primary to September because there are a few states that have primaries later in the year, and there was a look to see whether it made sense to compress the primary and general election to September and November. The end result of this task force that was established said that moving the primary to September, not a good thing. It did say that moving the primary in presidential years up would be a good thing. The commission did urge the national parties to try to come up with a better schedule. And ultimately, though, it said if the national parties were unable to come up with better schedules for the states, then Pennsylvania should, in fact, move it up to March in order to better put itself in position for more meaningful elections in presidential election years. If you look at the 2020 primary calendar, we are one of the last states. California, which used to be back in June for many, many years, is now ahead of us in 2020. And so I think it's important that we, being the fifth or sixth largest state, have a meaningful impact in regard to the primary schedule. 2020, though, is already set, so I specifically, when I introduced my bill, made the effective date 2024. In looking at both the Democratic and Republican Party structures for 2020, there would be some penalties if at this point we were to try to move our primary ahead of a certain point in March. So there are no penalties from either of the parties if we do it in 2024. And so I have drafted this bill in order to do it. It was actually Representative Freeman back in, back in, 1998, I believe, that we ended up moving the primary for 1 year up to the first Tuesday in April. Representative Reedshaw, who is still around at that point, tried to move it up to the third Tuesday in March. But that ended up being voted down because there was an agreement between the House and Senate for 2000 election to have it that first Tuesday in April. So again, this would move it to the third Tuesday in March, which would actually put us with a couple of other states, including Florida and Illinois, which have their primaries on that date in 2024. I would ask for your support.
Thank you very much, Senator Gordner. I'd like to recognize that Senator Judy Ward and Senator Katie Muth have joined the committee. Are there any questions or discussions on this legislation? Seeing none, are there any negative votes on this legislation? Seeing none, hearing none, the ayes have it, and the bill as committed will now be reported to the full Senate for consideration. The next item I'd like to call up is Senate Resolution 272, sponsored by Senator Argyle and Senator Mastriano. Is there a motion to consider the resolution? Moved by Senator Mastriano, seconded by Senator Stefano. Senate Resolution 272 is now before the committee. This resolution would recognize November of 2019 as Victims of Communism Memorial Month. The chair would like to recognize Senator Argyle, followed by Senator Mastriano, to say a few words on their resolution. Dave.
Microphone.
The 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. our good senator served along that very difficult frontier, and so we think that this would certainly be an appropriate time to commemorate and memorialize the many terrible victims of that awful time in world history. Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Mastriano?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to partner with Senator Argel on this important piece of legislation. Having served on the Iron Curtain during the last days of the Cold War, I got to see firsthand the tragic consequences of that system of government being imposed upon an entire continent. And serving on the front lines of freedoms obviously was interesting, and occasionally we'd see people from the East try to escape, and helplessly on our side in West Germany, not able to help them unless they crossed the border, and usually shot at. And happened to meet one of these young men that tried to escape from East Berlin on one of my visits to the East. And he told me his awful story about being shipped off to a labor camp as punishment for several years. And all he could lament was the lack of freedom. When the Iron Curtain came down in 1989, and being near the border with some of my soldiers, I remember welcoming large groups of Eastern Europeans to freedom for the first times in their lives, and seeing the joy that they had in their eyes was just amazing. I've never saw a spark of light, and that was just simply having freedom once again. Benjamin Franklin was asked during the Constitutional Convention, he asked, of course, at the opening close with prayer, and one of his colleagues was concerned about religion. He goes, well, think about all the casualties of religion across the years. And Benjamin Franklin, I'm paraphrasing, said, imagine what men will do without religion restraining them. And we saw that in the past century with communism, where estimates are up to 100 million people died underneath this atheistic system, where there's no restraints, where men and women decide who lives and who doesn't live. And so I stand together with Senator Argel in recognition of this. Having spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, especially Northern Europe, and the Baltic countries, I visited the torture houses where the KGB would torture men, women, and children simply for thinking or saying things that were not in line with the government. And that's the form of government and system that we stood against. And I reaffirm and stand with Senator Argel on this whole legislation. Thank you.
Thank you both. Are there any questions or discussion on the resolution? Senator Chairman Williams.
Thank you. My family has served in the military during those conflicts, so I understand the context in which one would recognize the evil deeds of fascists and communists during that period of time. But I also will tell you honestly, I'm conflicted by the optics of this. We have a rising political activity in this country as it relates to economic redistribution. Terms such as socialism, communism, capitalism are now used in political activities. And I want to make it clear for the record, I have no problem with competing in this country under the capitalist process, even though it has significant challenges to people of color specifically. And for the record, I'll make it quite clear, communism and social economic redistribution are issues that I've dealt with for my entire life. The Panther Party and a variety of others talked about those issues of economic inequities under capitalist society. But I'm quite clear that the consequence of what happened when capitalism became a part of what we dealt with was not positive for black and brown people who were poor. But the current set of circumstances, frankly, are very challenging for me. I'm going to support this resolution, but with significant reservations. And I can only tell you honestly, the politics of today are dramatically different than the politics of the generation I grew up in this area. This conversation about economic redistribution is significant and should be discussed. When 1% of our economic class exceeds the entire economic level of the middle class, that's a problem for all human beings. And it will be a challenge to this country. But the reality is also this. I have a president who interacts with a foreign country, specifically Putin, in a way that I find to be very, very dangerous when it relates to our economic stability. And so there are very, very, very significant optic issues as it relates to us moving this particular resolution at this time. And I just want to make sure for the record we're clear about that. And those are things that we will have to face as all Americans whether they are rural, urban, or suburban, are increasingly feeling suppressed by our declining economic status globally, and frankly, many middle-class people and those who are considered modest income are feeling challenged by what we describe as capitalism. And so, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairwoman, and those who are offering this resolution, I want to give the ultimate level of respect, certainly to my colleague who has served during that period of time, but I want them to be quite clear this is challenging for a person like me who sees the many different levels that this particular resolution can be interpreted. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or discussion on the resolution? Senator Mastriano.
Thank you very much. I'm moved by my interactions with people in Eastern Northern Europe who lived underneath the system, some from 1917 on, but most after the occupation of the Red Army in 1944 and 1945. And the stories they told me, firsthand experiences of total government control of schools, of the economy, of politics, press, thought, and suppression of religion and freedom of expression. And I stand with my friends in the East for this horrible epic they went through. And the people in the eastern portions of Europe and northern portions of Europe look to America to safeguard them from that from happening again. They've had a rough century. And the experiment in Venezuela, among other places there, and the suffering of the people of once prosperous countries there stands as an example to us of the dangers of total government control. It's just as simple as this. When you'd visit East Germany, one of the most prosperous of these communist countries, you'd ask the people you're visiting, what can we bring? And they'll say toilet paper. Even basic commodities were lacking there. That's total government control. You would buy a car 10 years before it was delivered to you. You'd pay full price for it. And the cars are made out of pressed wood, two-stroke engines. I only know this because one of them crashed into my Humvee after the Iron Curtain came down. Thank God it was okay, but the front end of the car disappeared. It was painted wood. I couldn't believe it. Pressed wood. Amazing. That's the kind of system here that rotted from the inside. And thank God for the United States of America standing with our allies around the world against this corrupt system that suppresses people and free thought. I rejoice that we live in a country where we have opportunities, where we can have our own views and not have it imposed to us by an intolerant government. One of the greatest minds of the last century was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he was simply thrown in jail for having divergent views on communist systems. And he came to America and shared his story of suffering in the gulags of Siberia. And it's just, we can't let that happen here. And one of the biggest things for us to do from a historic standpoint is remember the sufferings of the past. As a historian here, I have a laboratory. Engineers and scientists, people from the STEM programs, they're a separate group of people. But I have a laboratory too as a historian. It's called the past. And I prefer to learn from others' mistakes and repeat them in my own life or the life of my nation or family. Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion on the resolution? If I may, Senator Mastriano, I had the opportunity to challenge myself as an 8th grader, and I read Solzhenitsyn's work, The Gulag Archipelago, and it really did help shape my worldview and my understanding of systems of government. And I will say this. Went on to be an exchange student in Germany and was able to witness the dichotomy between East Germany and West Germany. And today, the only way I could explain it is a horrific brigadoon, where you were transported back in time, and it was not, it was shocking. So I thank you for bringing this resolution forward, and would see if we have any negative votes on this legislation. Seeing none, hearing none, the ayes have it. The resolution as committed will now be reported to the full Senate for consideration. Thank you. The final item I'd like to call up is House Bill 1896. It's sponsored by Representative Hennessy. Is there a motion to consider the bill? Moved by Senator Mastriano, seconded by Senator Gordner. House Bill 1896 is now before the committee. This bill authorizes the release of a use restriction and reversionary interest affecting land in East Vincent Township, Chester County. I now offer Amendment A 03789. Is there a motion to consider the amendment? Moved by Senator Ward. Is there a second? Seconded by Senator Gordner. Amendment A03789 is before the committee. This amendment is a comprehensive amendment that would include a conveyance in Center County as well as the conveyance of an easement in Chester County. The language relating to the conveyance in Center County authorizes the Department of General Services, with the approval of the governor, to grant and convey a certain parcel of land situate in Benner Township. The language relating to the easement in Chester County authorizes DGS, with the approval of Westchester University of Pennsylvania in the state system of higher education, and the governor, to grant and convey to Aqua Pennsylvania Incorporated a potable water tower together with a permanent utility easement from lands of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania at Westchester University in the borough of Westchester, Chester County. Are there any questions or discussions regarding the amendment? Seeing no further discussion, we'll now vote on Amendment A03789. Are there any negative votes on the amendment? Seeing none, hearing none, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there any questions or comments on the bill as amended? Are there any negative votes on the bill as amended? Seeing none, hearing none, the ayes have it, and the bill as amended will now be reported to the full Senate for its consideration. The second part of today's meeting is a confirmation hearing to consider the nomination of Kathy Boockvar from Bucks County as Secretary of the Commonwealth. The chair would like to recognize Senator Sanacero to introduce Ms. Boockvar. Senator Sanacero.
Thank you, Chair Phillips-Hill, Chair Williams, and all the members of the committee. I'm grateful to have the opportunity today to once again introduce my good friend and constituent, the acting Secretary of the Commonwealth, Kathy Boockvar. And I may have been a bit premature back in June when I said that I hoped that this would be the first step in the process of removing the word acting. I'm hoping today that will in fact be the case. Kathy Boockvar is someone who has devoted her life to public service. She is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, where she went as an undergraduate, and then later to the American University Washington School of Law, where I will note, and this will undoubtedly embarrass her, she met her future husband, Judge-elect Jordan Yeager. We're all very excited about that. She then went on to do work in the for a legal services organization representing seniors and disabled people, and later in the private sector focused on employment law. After that, the Auditor General De Pasquale, one of our former colleagues in the State House, tapped Kathy to be the Chief Counsel for the Auditor General's office, where she served with distinction. Kathy has also worked to represent our veterans as a volunteer attorney with a program called Wills for Heroes, providing essential legal documents free of charge to them and other first responders as well. Earlier this year, Governor Wolf chose Kathy to lead the Department of State. And in the brief time in which she has had that position, she has really distinguished herself. She's been very active on the issue of the modernization of our voting system. She's worked collaboratively with her colleagues across the United States, other secretaries of state in other states, in doing just that. And she has worked closely with this legislature as well on issues relating to our voting system and other matters that come before the department. It's rare, I think, that we have someone who comes before us who has truly devoted most of her adult life to serving the public. But that is exactly who Kathy Boockvar is. She is someone who is motivated by making sure that in the case of our voting system, that it is secure and that every vote is counted. And she's someone who is devoted to making sure that there is good constituent service at the department as well. I believe that if confirmed, Secretary Boockvar will continue to serve the Commonwealth well, and we in the Senate will be proud to have put her in that position through the confirmation process. I urge this committee to recommend her nomination to the full Senate, and I look forward to the opportunity to voting in favor of that this coming week. Without further ado, Acting Secretary Boockvar.
Thank you, Senator Santicero, and I would like to now turn things over and focus on Ms. Boockvar. And if I could, please ask you to stand and raise your right hand to be sworn. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please affirm by saying yes.
Yes.
Thank you. And now we'd like you to be center stage and have the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Senator Santicero, and thank you to the whole committee. You know, one of the things over the last 6 months to a year, I have to say one of the things I'm most proud about are the many bipartisan accomplishments and partnerships that we've had the opportunity to have. Very proud to have been asked to serve as the National Association of Secretaries of State Elections Committee co-chair by my colleagues across the country. Very proud to have partnered closely with President Trump's Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to make sure that both across the Commonwealth and across the nation, we have the strongest election security. Excuse me. Very proud to have collaborated with our many nonpartisan stakeholders to improve professional licensure for Pennsylvania's licensees, from the Hospital Association of Pennsylvania to the Pennsylvania Higher Education Nursing Schools to the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors and many, many others to make sure that we're representing and advancing licensure in Pennsylvania. I'm very proud to have collaborated with so many of you, all of you, to pass some critical legislation over the last 6 months, from Act 41, making it easier for people with licenses in other states to receive their licenses in Pennsylvania. Act 98 and 99, which we partnered closely with you, Senator Gordner, to make sure that we could make it easier and clarify roles of delegates for certain licensed professionals when they're doing medical agreements. And of course, most recently, really proud of Act 77, a very bipartisan, broad-reaching elections bill that really provides options to Pennsylvania voters that we haven't seen in over 80 years. You know, I'm proud to have been the only Secretary of State in the country to have been invited to testify before Congress for a bipartisan congressional hearing for the Judiciary Committee called Securing America's Elections. And I think they told me that day that it was perhaps the only nonpartisan hearing that they've had in about a year. So I was very honored that both sides of the aisle were able to agree on myself and the other two witnesses. And of course, one of my main jobs is working very closely with the bipartisan election directors, county commissioners, CIOs across this Commonwealth who have just been incredible partners in ensuring that we have the most secure elections and well run. So together we've accomplished so much in the last 6 months to a year, and I really look forward to working with all of you to go from here and do even more. So thank you very much.
I want to thank you so much for being here, and would like to begin with some questions that I have, and then open the floor to some members for their questions. Your testimony, it reflects some of the recent challenges that we faced in municipal elections, in particular in York County, where I represent, as well as your plans for solutions. And I would be terribly remiss if I did not say that how much I appreciate you and your staff meeting with me, coming down to York to discuss those issues about a week and a half ago. And as you know, York County's challenges were significant, more significant than most other counties. Our county, of course, had long lines, some well over an hour. We had people walking away from the polls, voters who had never missed a vote in decades. We had ballots that were printed on the wrong size paper. And, you know, in one event case, as I shared with you, the very resourceful poll workers borrowed the paper cutter from the Sunday school class at the church where the poll is. We had problems with stubs on ballots. Other areas, it was marking devices bleeding through ballots. Voters who had their ballots exposed as they were inserting them into the scanner. And of course, Article 7, Section 4 assures the secrecy of our ballots shall be preserved. I'm sure many of the people in this committee and folks who are listening in have listened and read all about what transpired with the secrecy and the disenfranchisement issues. I think we have a possible fix, and I want to thank you, you and your staff, for assisting with that effort to ensure that we uphold the constitutional right to vote and to vote in secrecy with this possible legislative fix to address it in the near future. Can you talk about the guidance that the Department of State and you are giving to our counties to ensure that people's constitutional rights to vote and the secrecy of their ballots, that those rights are upheld?
Absolutely. Sorry, I seem to be losing my voice. Bad timing. Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman, also for being willing to meet with me on such short notice, and Michael as well, in York that week of Election Day, because I really wanted to make sure that we were closely in touch on all the issues that, you know, obviously are especially close to your heart that occurred in York and other places in the state. And thank you very much for partnering also so quickly on the potential legislation to fix some of these issues. So, if you're focused specifically on privacy, you know, one of the things I was talking to Senator Mastriano about just before we started this hearing is we have extensive guidance, directives, checklists, and so forth that the Department of State provides every year to the counties. And so just in general, it may be, we'd be happy to provide you with copies of all those things. And those cover the gamut, basically. And so from everything from pre-election testing to running an election to programming the ballots to, you know, all the various components of an election. So that's sort of a broader picture than I think you're asking about specifically. But as we discussed when we met, you know, obviously we have the constitutional right to privacy for every voter. That's so critical to all of us. And when the electronic voting systems came into play after HAVA in 2006, there were some specific components that were added to the statutes with regard to electronic voting systems, and I think I shared some of those with you when we met. And then when I asked my staff, were there as specific requirements relating to hand-marked paper ballots, the privacy stations, the scanners, it was clear that there hasn't been statutorily nearly as much guidance. And so one of the things that we talked about is, can we change that to make sure that we have the authority at the Department of State to set those standards to make sure that the counties they of course would want to meet them too, but need to know what does meet it. So I very much appreciated your taking leadership on this. And, you know, I think what it looks like might look slightly different for each of the different voting systems. But I think ultimately people want to feel like both when they're filling in the ballots and when they're scanning them, that there's not a poll worker who's well-meaning, right? Nobody wants to invade people's privacy, but want to make sure that they feel that they can control the vision of be the only ones with the vision of their ballots. So some of the things that I think happened this year were also going from, so if you were going from an electronic machine, for example, like the Danaher that's used in both Bucks County and Dauphin County, there's an enclosed curtain, kind of like there used to be for the lever machines, which I think we all sort of, you know, for those of you that remember, you know, and it was, you knew you were done because you had moved the lever over and the curtain went out, and it was there was a strong sense of privacy. It's different when you're filling in circles on a piece of paper and there are these more privacy booths. So I think we need to give better guidance to the counties, and I think this legislation is a really good start for how to do that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to recognize Senator Ward. She has another obligation here in the Capitol, and I know she wants to ask a question, and then hopefully we can come back and follow up on that. So thank you, Senator Ward.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Just quickly, can you give an update on some of the professional licensure issues that have been problematic in the past? Have they been corrected? Because that's been an ongoing issue.
Thank you, Senator Ward, and it was very nice to appear before PHENSA, the Pennsylvania Higher Education Nursing Schools Association, together at that conference. And yeah, I'm actually thrilled to talk about BPOA and the advances that we've been making. So, and I think we might have probably talked some about this at PHENSA. So earlier this year in the spring, I brought in a new acting commissioner, actually Kalonji Johnson, who was or is in the audience for the BPOA. Also hired a new director of operations. We also hired a new director of intergovernmental affairs, who's basically manages stakeholder outreach. And we've been sort of on a really intensive move to look at every corner of the operations at the entire Bureau of Professional and Occupational Affairs. So basically, we've gathered together, not just the three of us, but cross-sector, legal, HR, operations, program area, together to literally look at the entire process from start to finish. And recently, we also just promoted an individual who has been our COOP manager and lean manager, is now going to be an agency director of operations who's been sitting down with each of the boards. Nursing, you'll be happy to hear, was first, and literally process mapping from start to finish what's involved in license processing in Pennsylvania, sitting with the frontline staff and the leadership to make sure that he's getting the full picture of how it's done now, where the pain points are, where the holdups are, where the bottlenecks are, where there are technological issues, where there are HR issues, where there are phone issues, literally every corner of it. So he's mapping the process and then looking at the pain points and looking at what the resolutions are needed, what training is needed, what technological improvements and so forth. So one of the areas I think you probably know well is the phones have been frustrating. So the phone system for nursing, the nursing board, has been longer wait times historically than I think any other board in the Commonwealth. And when I was an executive director of a women's health organization, I remember well trying to get through to the nursing board. So one of the first things that we did was when we were looking at the comparative phone wait times, which obviously is incredibly frustrating for professionals and stakeholders alike, I said, how is it set up? What's the phone tree? How does it work? And we realized that it was set up completely differently for the nursing board than for every other board in the Commonwealth. So, and it had almost 10 times longer wait times. So, asked a simple question, why is it set up that way? And I got a bunch of blank looks because it had always been that way and nobody knew why. So I'm really pleased to say that on just that issue alone, we've reduced in the last couple of months by changing the way the phone tree is set up, by retraining the people of how the calls come in, we've reduced the wait time from approximately 45 minutes is what it was to about 3-4 minutes for the nursing. So now nursing is completely in line with all the other boards, which is obviously, it's a huge advance, but it's what should have happened, a decade ago, right? But same for all the other, so the process mapping and the training of staff has also been hugely helpful for processing time itself. So you might have seen an article earlier this summer which talked about how in 2018, which was when PALS was going in, the processing times were at an all-time high. So I think the nursing average in 2018 was something like 88 days. That's unacceptable, right? So just from the changes we've made by training, looking at the staff, making sure that we have all the ducks in a row at each point of the process, as of a couple of months ago, or maybe even more recently than that, the Pennsylvania average processing time from start to finish in Pennsylvania was more in the range of, say, 56 to 60 days from 88. So a huge improvement. And one of the other things we did, I think you and I have talked about this, one of the things that has frustrated me over the last 6 months is learning that even the words used, processing time, I think we talked about this at the FENSA meeting, mean different things at different times to different people. And this is not just Pennsylvania, this is literally across the country. So if you ask, some random state, Minnesota, what's their processing time? And I know, Senator Collette, you're also a nurse, so you share the same frustrations. They would pick a slice in time. So, for example, you might have a state that would say processing time from the date of a complete application is 9 days. But they wouldn't tell you that it took 60 days to get to a complete application. So once I realized that this is how it was being done across the country, I said no more. And so in Pennsylvania, we rolled out a couple of months ago what we call a guide or a navigator guide. And nursing was one of the first 3 professions that was included. It was nursing, cosmetologists, and osteopathic physicians. And we literally broke down the entire process from start to finish into 3 phases. So and giving an estimated time frame for each phase of the process, as well as complete information about what applicants, nursing schools, any other stakeholders could expect from when you apply. What does it mean? So no more slicing and dicing, just the full, complete picture. And it's been a huge help. The stakeholders are thrilled because they can actually anticipate. It gives tips to the applicants as well. So for example, if for nursing, we can't begin to process their application until the person graduates from school. But understandably, the schools want to encourage their students to apply early, which is great, and I'm never going to discourage people from applying early, but if you've applied early and you don't realize that the processing can't start until you've graduated, then if you've applied a month early, that adds a month. So what we did was we're making sure that every applicant knows tips on what they can do in the meantime. They could get background checks. They could start looking at the NCLEX exam. There's all kinds of things they could do. So I'm sorry, I could go on, but you could tell that this is something that we're really passionately working on at Department of State.
You mentioned 60 days wait time. I know it's down from what it had been, but I I hope that's not acceptable.
So, and I'll tell you, one of the things that's been, nothing's ever good enough, right? We will always be looking to do better and better and better. But one of the things when I started trying to figure out about how other states did it, we literally looked at states across the entire country, both to see who reported full information, and then for the ones that did, which were about a handful, tell the whole process, what their average wait times were. And for nursing, for example, we are low to average in terms of processing time at 60 days. So for example, California is something like 10 to 12 weeks. New York, although their language was a little bit ambiguous, so I'm not 100% sure whether it's really start to finish or if it's just a slice, but that was 8 to 10 weeks. We looked at states literally across the country, and 60 days is on par to low. Having said that, I promise you that we are looking for every advance. Every day we could save in the process, we will do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ward. Senator Mastriano.
Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be able to ask you a few questions here. I guess I'll just stick with one. Of course, have been allegations of fraud and irregularities, both from the left and right, on the elections in 2016 specifically. I guess it's nothing new under the sun. Thucydides said in Greece in 2,400 years ago, in a democracy, someone who fails to get elected can always console himself with the thought that there was something not quite fair about it. So I guess that will always linger there. But as Abraham Lincoln rightly said, elections belong to the people, and it's their decision. So how do we maintain the integrity of our elections, since it's paramount to the survival of our republic? And I'm interested specifically in what measures you have in mind to safeguard our elections in next year's critical, vital election. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you again for your service as well. Really appreciate it. Can I just say really quickly that I had the opportunity to be in Germany at the wall in 1990, and to be there the year after the wall fell was just incredibly emotional and meaningful. So thank you again. So as we talked about a little bit before this meeting started, there's a lot of different processes in place that make sure that we are protecting the vote, the integrity and the security of the vote. And in addition to what's already in place, and I'll go through some of those, the new systems provide even more of that. So one of the things, and again, I think it may be helpful for us to actually come to your office or provide to your office some of the directions that we give to the counties that they follow. But for example, one of the things I think people don't realize is how the numbered list of voters in Pennsylvania, you go in, you wait in line, and the first thing you do is, well, every polling place may set it up a little bit differently, but there's a numbered list of voters. And then in addition to that, there's the signature poll book, right? So the numbered list of voters, though sometimes has been frustrating because you might have lines and bottlenecks because it's usually one number list of voters. The truth is it serves a critical purpose in Pennsylvania because it's so if you were just signing in the book, it's only one signature, one time that you're listed. If you've also in the numbered list of voters, it's another way for reconciliation to be ensured. So every precinct is required to reconcile the numbered list of voters with the counts on the back of the machines. So, and then the new voting systems add, and by the way, and then that is sent, so then the county gets all the precincts, and then that's also available to the Department of State. So in addition to that, there's the new systems have not only paper, which I know you, I'm sure, are well familiar with the importance of paper, and I'll just talk about it. So we have the paper ballots, which provide a level of, both the tangible verifiability of it, but then also that's the ballot of record. So you can go back and check that that vote actually was cast, as opposed to not knowing when you push an electronic button. But in addition to the actual physical paper, all the systems scan that. So you've got a scan of the vote and a paper copy of the vote. So for example, you couldn't feed a piece of paper into the box. If it hadn't gone through the scan, that would be easily noticed. But the key is audits. And so I know one of the things that we've talked some about, and I hope we'll talk extensively about today, is, and actually, when, I don't know if you heard, did Director Krebs, I can't remember, when Chris Krebs from the Department of Homeland Security was in Pennsylvania. I can't remember if it was during our meeting or whether it was just in the press conference, but he specifically said, post-election audits are not so much to convince the winner that they've won, but to convince the loser that they've lost, which I think is consistent with where you started here. Paper ballots without post-election audits have limited utility, but combined with post-election audits are a huge both assurance that the outcome is correct, but also ensuring that those votes actually match, right? So you can compare the barcode tabulated vote with the actual paper, and there's a scan of it as well. So these are some of the things, and far more that we could talk about. But did that answer your question? Great, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mastriano. Senator Gordner.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
Let me put one dig in there, and then I'll get to the question. As you know, I had a bill that was going to set up a 6-month commission to look at if and when someone was going to decertify election machines. And I was told by you, and the governor also during his veto message said that 6 months was just this horribly long period of time and would just make the whole decertification process not work and just be too short. So obviously in February of 2018, Governor Wolf said that he was going to decertify the voting machines that were in existence at that point. We are now 21 months since the governor said that he was going to do that. That's almost 4 times the 6-month time period that the commission would have operated. So can you tell me, and I forget if it's the governor or you who do it, but are the election machines that were in existence in February 2018 going to be decertified, and when?
Absolutely, and thank you. So actually the circumstances that we find ourselves in now are exactly the reason why we didn't set a specific date. Because we said for the last year and a half, and actually even before I got here, that the reason why we didn't want to set a date is to account for special elections. So we are actually in this exact scenario that we wanted to make sure that we protected the voters, where, for example, in Dauphin County is part of the 3, so Dauphin, Lebanon, and York, right, thank you, are the 3 counties impacted by the January 14th special election. And while York and Lebanon have both already upgraded to their new voting systems, Dauphin County has not. So I spoke about this with Chairwoman Phillips-Hill when we met, that actually this is exactly why we did it this way, to make sure that Dauphin County voters, though they haven't upgraded to a new system yet, will be able to, and that as soon as that system is no longer needed by the voters, that it will be decertified. So now, of course, we have 3 additional special elections that are coming as a result of various legislators winning other races or otherwise retiring. And so when I talked with Chairwoman Phillips-Hill, I said, obviously, if what would make it easiest is if those special elections are held on the primary day, in which case, if that's the case, then we'll decertify probably the day after the January 14th, at least for that voting system. All the other voting systems that are not relevant for the special elections, we can decertify at any point. But the ones that are needed in the special elections, we obviously don't want to disenfranchise those voters. So that's the whole reason why the date hasn't been set, was purely to ensure that we didn't disenfranchise anyone. And Senator, I just want to also just make sure, the 6-month, the SB 48, the reason why the department wanted to make sure that there was at least some flexibility was because, let's say, for example, you were on the ballot for, let's say this is 2 months ago and you were on the ballot for November, and let's say we found out that in 6 other states that voting system had severe tabulation problems. I wouldn't want, as Secretary of State, I wouldn't want any candidate for office to be put in that position where you're wondering whether the system being used by your voters is not functioning well.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into that whole argument again because the same machines, I mean, this will get groans from people sitting up here, but the same machines that the governor said back in February of 2018 wasn't reliable, was used for multiple elections. So that takes away the argument that you just said, because again, in February 2018, the governor and your department said that these machines were not going to be reliable and shouldn't be used anymore, were used in multiple elections.
We wanted to make sure that the counties and the voters had an opportunity to transition.
But it just takes away the argument that you just said. So, and again, mine said 50% or more, so it wasn't as if there was a certain, if there was a bad machine in a county or something like that, absolutely get rid of it. So you're saying sometime in mid-January, the department, or is it
It's
it
the
you?
department, yes.
So it'd be you signing the
Correct.
decertification?
Correct.
All right. So let's just get to the next question. At least, and I haven't talked to the Dauphin County commissioners, but at least from what I read, at the moment, they are saying we're not going to change machines. So what are you going to do with Dauphin County come the middle of January?
So the reporting on it was not quite accurate, and so we have spoken with Dauphin County, and I hope to be meeting with Dauphin County this week specifically. But we have already spoken with them, and what actually happened was that only 2 out of 3 of the commissioners were present at that meeting, and nobody made the motion to consider purchasing a new system. So it's not that they voted down a motion, nobody made the forward motion. So we've been saying for the last year and a half that before the primary of 2020, we're going to be decertifying the voting systems. Dauphin County does not fall into the category of counties that we offered an extension to because they don't have a voter verifiable paper trail. And so they've been told, for the last year and a half that it will be decertified. And I hope very much that we've been speaking with Dauphin County, various folks from the county for the last year and a half about this. I know that they've been doing the research, looking at lots of voting systems, had demos, got feedback from voters. So I'm very hopeful that they will, in fact, move forward. They're the only county in the Commonwealth that is giving pushback at this point.
Right. And if they don't?
They're going to end up in court.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you, Senator Gordner. If we could go back and follow up on the path that we had begun going down, I appreciate the conversation you had with Senator Gordner. We do have hard deadlines. They're rapidly approaching. The special election for the new senator in the 48th is January 14th. That's less than 2 months away. With the problems that we had earlier this month, what are the plans should there be any further challenges during the special election?
So I want to say that plans for 2020, January or otherwise, started months ago in the Department of State. And so what we did, and I think I might have spoken to you some about this when we met, we started an initiative called Ready to Vote 2020, and back in maybe late spring or early summer. And because obviously we knew that this was going to be not only a major year in and of itself, but obviously with new voting systems, even before Act 77, with new voting systems alone, that was going to add challenges to the county's roles. And so we put out a survey to the counties, to all the county election directors, to say, tell us your biggest concerns, where you can most use assistance and help from the Department of State. Where can we be most helpful in the next 6 months, year and a half as we head into 2020? And so that was really helpful. What they identified even back then was their biggest needs were public education, and poll worker recruitment and training. So we started putting together plans to hit on all these factors. And then, of course, both the circumstances that have helped shed light on where the biggest needs are with regard to voting systems and polling place resources. But then in addition, Act 77 has made this initiative even more important, right? Because we have a short period of time to implement a lot of different things. So this kind of through this hub, but really in general, we're hitting on a bunch of different points. So as you mentioned, one of the problems that York faced specifically, and several other counties, is that they didn't have sufficient polling place resources, like insufficient numbers of scanners. So like this is something that a number of counties had lines, but it was certainly most highlighted in York. And as we spoke about when we met, we've provided, so we work very, very closely with counties across the state, but counties utilize our services in different levels, right? And York was one of the ones that had not been very much in touch with, they weren't attending election director conferences, they weren't in touch with us, they didn't ask for assistance. We provided them all the same information, of course, as anybody else, but some of the counties are constantly utilizing our services. So for example, both even before Ready to Vote 2020 and since, one of the things that we've done is help counties negotiate with vendors, make sure that they have enough polling place resources, make sure that they have provisions in their contracts that have the appropriate warranties and so forth, service, all training from the vendors. And so the issues faced in York on Election Day highlight that this is ever more critical going forward. So this is going to be, we're going to heighten that, not just offering of here's our suggestions, but really emphasizing the consequences of not having sufficient polling place resources. And York was Exhibit A of that, right? We can't have that happen. The good news is most counties were already planning for that for 2020 because they knew it was going to be a high turnout election. They weren't expecting it in 2019. The other good news is that in 2020, it's a much shorter ballot, and I know we talked about this when we met. So 2019, the municipal elections are the longest ballots, the most complicated, and particularly when you're shifting from, say, a DRE, direct recording electronic machine, to, say, hand-marked paper, which most of the counties have selected. There's a transition, there's both a transition in terms of learning, but then there's also time. It takes a long time to fill out a municipal election year ballot. So next year in the primary, you're talking about, depending on whether there's a state senatorial race in that particular district, you're talking about approximately 8 races in the primary, 8 or 9 races in the primary, and 7 or 8 races in the general. So though it will be a high turnout election, the good news is it will be a much simpler ballot. The other good news is we have Act 77, and thank you again for your leadership on passing that. Act 77 is going to have an impact on preparing for 2020, positive impact in so many ways. So one, the provision now that anybody can vote by mail for any reason or no reason at all means that it's not just voters who have a excuse anymore who can vote before Election Day. And that's a huge advantage. Also extending the absentee deadline to 8 p.m. on Election Day means that people that don't get their ballots in earlier can still hand it in literally up until 8 p.m. on Election Day. Although, of course, they could presumably also go to the precinct and do that. But and in addition, we talked about some of the challenges that York faced related to scanning. Well, not just York. Some of the problems with scanning that several counties across the Commonwealth faced were related to precinct scanning of absentee ballots that had been folded. I know in York they were cut the wrong size. I know that there were a couple of other places that happened. But Act 77, one of the things it does is it all counting of absentees is now done centrally by the county. So they use high-speed, high-capacity scanners that don't have those issues with the precinct's smaller scanners. So that's a huge help. But having said all that, there still needs to be sufficient number of scanners, sufficient number of ballot marking devices in every polling place. And we have at Department of State, and we've provided again to the counties, but are going to re-emphasize. We have 7 voting systems that were certified in Pennsylvania, and they all have different speed and output. And we've been handing out a sheet that tells you how many voters per hour each component of these voting systems can handle. And, you know, it goes without saying that a system that could handle 30 voters per hour, you need a different number of those, right, than one that handles 125 voters per hour. So again, York, unfortunately, was Exhibit A on November 5th. We will use that not only to help York plan better, but also use it with every county to make sure that they plan better.
Thank you. That was very evident last Thursday. There was a meeting, and apparently they were not using the Department of State information, but in fact using a formula that was derived by the company that proved to not be very reliable. So one of the questions that came up is this question of what is the voter verifiable record of each vote, right? So a couple people said, you know, when I used to go in and I would touch that screen at the end, it would say to me, this is who I voted for president, this is who I voted for United States Senate and Congress, and so on down the line. Can you talk about ballot marking devices and how voters can be assured that scanners are accurately summarizing their votes, since I don't think any of us can read BMD codes and only the scanners can. So I think that would be really helpful for voters to understand.
Absolutely. So one of the things when we were, back before we started examining voting systems, in Pennsylvania, we created new security standards to make sure that we were providing the highest level of protection to Pennsylvania voters. And one of the things that we did was ensure that every single piece of paper, that's the paper record of the vote, has the human readable text. So whether they have a barcode or a QR code or timing marks that are used to tabulate, every single paper record has to have the human readable text, because like you said, you can't verify your vote if it's a barcode alone. And so some states, they don't have that. And they have what's called an autocast option, which sort of bypasses the verifiability. We don't allow that in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, every paper, whether it's a ballot marking device or a hand-marked piece of paper, has the human readable text. And so basically, and I'm happy to come separately and show you literally pictures of the different ballots or the paper records. But some of the, so in Pennsylvania, counties were able to choose either hand-marked paper ballot, where you're filling in that looks like an absentee, or these ballot marking devices where you feed in a piece of paper and you can touch the screen and it prints out your selections. Either way, there's a physical record that shows your selections. And what they look like varies. So some of them look like absentee ballots, but some of them look like a sheet of paper that lists who you voted for. So if I voted for, Joe Smith for president and, Ellen Jones for, Senate, and let's say I didn't want to make a selection in the, U.S. representative race, it would actually tell me no selection. Like, that's what would be listed. So you could literally see what you voted for each of the races or if you didn't vote. In Pennsylvania, that paper is the ballot of record. And some of the systems have a barcode as well as or a QR code. And those are used to help tabulate or to identify the ballot style. So each system is a little different, and it's why it may be helpful actually for me to come in with our voting system analysts who could explain as much detail as you'd like. But basically, it's why, again, post-election audits are so important, because you not only want the voter verifiability of the plain text, which every one of our systems has, but you also want to know that the barcode or the QR code reflects what you intended. So today, actually, as we speak, the first pilot audit is happening in Mercer County. I would be there, but for being here instead, but Jonathan Marks and other members of our elections team are there. Philadelphia is doing their pilot audit on Thursday. And, you know, they both have two different systems, so it's going to be really helpful to sort of see how it's different in different counties. But the intent is both to confirm the outcome of the election, but also to be able to say, hey, we can see that whether you scan it with the barcode or you hand count looking at the paper ballots, you get the same outcome. And that's a huge voter assurance, tool.
I appreciate that, because that actually the pre-certification auditing process and an update on how it's going was going to be my next question. And my sense is, and I would like to get your input on this, is how this process would assist with avoiding future problems on Election Day.
That's a really good question. And I'll tell you, I can't speak highly enough of the process that we've been going through with this for examining post-election audits, and I really look forward to meeting with you and whomever else will be taking the next step. Just so you know, we created, when we wanted to start exploring post-election audits, we created a work group. And it's made up of 6 county election directors, and that's Mercer, Philly, Mifflin, Lancaster, Sullivan County, and Allegheny County. So different sizes, shapes, different parts of the state, sorry. And it's been really helpful having those election directors involved, because they've been weighing in on not only listening to the best practices, but also considering the actual processes that they already follow in Pennsylvania in running elections. And so integrating where and when the audit should happen in relation to their processes as they already exist. I think, to your question, and so the group is going to be coming up with recommendations, and that's when I'd love to sit down with you and this committee and whomever else to talk about what pieces would be helpful legislatively, because we have a sort of flat 2% audit in place now that's done sort of differently in different counties and doesn't have that same ability to confirm the outcome of the election. But to your question about how it will prevent future problems, I think what the audit is most useful for is really increasing voter confidence about their vote being counted and counted accurately, more so than it goes to any particular problems or issues faced. But I do think it's all related, right? So if you have confidence because you know every election there's going to be a statistically significant audit. So it's not going to be only used when you're within 0.5%, like a recount. We're going to have specific standards that would say, for example, one of the things that we're talking about in the work group is saying the top race, so for example, the presidential race on a presidential year, or whatever the top race is of that year, that race would be one of the races that's audited, because everybody will want that. But then you would also have a random race selected. So going back to Senator Mastriano's question, it's a safety, it's a security and integrity precaution too. By not announcing which race it's going to be, that's going to be randomly selected. you know that somebody can't commit fraud sort of knowing that that particular race is going to be audited. You have a random selection made so that, again, you increase voter confidence because you're able to literally confirm the outcome of the results. So it's did that answer your question? It serves multiple purposes, but a lot of it is really about voter confidence, both in the integrity and the security and the verifiability of the outcome of the election.
A lot of comments, a lot of references in your testimony with regard to the recent enactment of Act 77. And you've answered a lot of the questions that I've had, but as we saw on Election Day in New York, there was a lot of challenges with dealing with the new machines and with the new changes in Act 77. You know, if you could just talk a little more specifically about how we're going to be certain that every poll worker is going to be brought up to speed and properly trained as we inch closer. We've got the special elections in January. We have the presidential primary coming up in April. If you could talk a little bit about that, because that was a huge concern.
Yeah. So one of the things, you know, we've had such a good experience with the post-election audit work group and involving the counties and Department of State and other stakeholders that one of my first reactions with Act 77 was, and we work closely with CCAP as well. So I was on the phone actually with Doug Hill after Act 77 passed, and we were talking about, planning forward, and, I said, oh, what we really need to do is form an Act 77 work group, because again, that intersection, the counties obviously play such a key role in both training poll workers and also just implementing all these processes. So we already last week, so we internally, Department of State has obviously started many different planning of the implementation of Act 77, and that's going to involve internally everything from technology changes, for example, adding vote by mail to the online absentee website and lots of other technological things, and forms and all kinds of changes sort of to the base functions. But then the counties obviously are going to have changes as well. So what we did was last week we decided that we already have, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but we have what's called the SURE Advisory Board. So SURE is our voter registration system. And we already have monthly meetings with, there are 5 counties that sit on that board. And we realized that there's going to be so much overlap between the SURE system, because obviously we're going to be changing the voter registration deadline from 30 to 15 days and changing the deadlines of when things come in, and that those counties already had a higher level of expertise and understanding of the implementation and how Act 77 would impact that. So what we decided to do was merge that into a larger work group, involve CCAP and other county commissioners as well. So we had our first meeting with the larger group on Thursday. And those counties, like I said, there are 5 from around the state. Philly and Allegheny County are actually not in that particular group, but I think that one or both of them are key because of their larger size. Some of the other counties involved are small and medium size, but those are going to be tremendously helpful to have that county input on both where Department of State can play the largest role in terms of their transition, but also how we can support the counties in making sure that the poll workers have all that information. So one of the first things we're doing is developing literally an information sheet on and a website on all the changes that Act 77 is bringing, both from the standpoint of the voter and from the standpoint of election administrators. And obviously there's overlap as well. And CCAP has asked me to speak at their conference, which is next week. Actually, it's the same day we're meeting with the York County Commissioners. And so I said that I would provide a 2-pager summary on that, and also spend time speaking with all the county commissioners about the impact of that bill. But then also we have election director conference in December. I know we're going to spend a lot of time on that, and we're going to have every other week phone calls with this group. So It's a lot, but it's critical that we make sure every piece of it is covered, make sure the poll workers are well trained, both again on the Act 77 components, but also on the issues that impacted York in particular on last Tuesday, the week before.
Thank you. And if you could keep us all updated and apprised of the progress that's being made there, we'd really appreciate it.
Happy to.
Thank you. Chairman Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mine, I don't have any questions. Mine's just a comment. This is a tremendously important department, overwhelming in terms of the size of the state, the complexity of things you deal with. I've dealt with Democrats and Republicans in terms of nominating process before. You've been incredibly responsive to a list of issues, and a rollout such as complicated and politically charged as the voting machines were and will be, continue to be, you've handled, frankly, in a magnificent way without showing bias one way or the other. I certainly could complain about issues in Philadelphia. I'm not. Because frankly, on the whole, it really went well. Now, I'm 62. The font on those cards is ridiculously small. Other than that, I really don't complain. So when I was checking who I voted for, I was like, okay, that was on purpose. I got that. No problem. I'm not a millennial. But that said, I just think that it should be reflected for the record. You know, we're going to move the process forward. But I want you to be very clear. Many of us are very comfortable with you personally, regardless of who nominates you, because of your experience, the manner in which you conduct yourself in an extraordinarily professional way. And as you know, sometimes we get to the bottom of some of these issues, and they're local, not the departments. And I think even with that said, you've managed to sort of bring divergent personalities together, regardless of whether Republican or Democrat, because, you know, there's no unison within the Republican grouping, and there's no unison within the Democrats. So when you come to Philadelphia, there are different types of Democrats, and you're dealing with different types of issues. So I just want to compliment you for how you've conducted yourself throughout the entire time you've been the acting person.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate that.
Senator Williams, we may need to do an amendment to have magnifying eyeglasses at all polling places going forward.
There is a button that says increase text size, because I too suffered from that issue. So look for it next time.
I will, but that button is small too, but that's the internet.
That's right.
Thank you, Chairman Williams. Senator Mastriano.
Thank you so much. I've received concerns from my district of some irregularities in the areas where we have schools, colleges, and there's allegations that some of the students are voting twice, both locally where they're in school and also back home. How do you ensure, I'm curious about your audits. Do your audits show anything like this? And also, additionally, how do we ensure that non-citizens aren't voting and that people are only voting once? We went to great lengths in Afghanistan to ensure free and fair elections there, and it was pretty easy there. It's pretty simple. I mean, they have to show an ID card more than we do here, and then they stick their finger in an inkwell, which can't be washed off in a day. So that way we ensure you only got one vote and every vote counts. So please give me a warm and fuzzy on how we're moving forward on this.
Thank you. And I think you and I talked about this some when we met personally as well. So thank you for asking. One of the things that we have in place in Pennsylvania is we're members of ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is a national nonprofit service, basically, that's entirely dedicated to making sure our lists are clean and preventing things like double voting. So now I'm trying to remember, at some point I was really tracking closely the number of states that are in it, but I think it's somewhere in the range of 28, which you can imagine, the more states that participate, the more information we can have, right? Because if Florida, say, is not involved, then we don't have Florida's data. So every state that gets added, and Florida did actually become a member, as I recall, in the last, I don't want to diss Florida, but the key is the states have to be working together on some of that, right, to make sure that we have the ability to see where somebody does vote elsewhere. So Eric has been a huge, huge addition to the voter integrity and prevention of that kind of thing front, including, again, making sure our lists are clean. So when there's deceased voters, helping identify those. I mean, there's also already other processes in place, but the more you're sharing information nationally, the better off we all are. One of the other things, so the audits, you asked about audits. I'm not sure that the post-election audit gets to what you're talking about specifically. I think it's more the other processes that are already in place. So for example, when you go into the polling place, you have to sign your name in the book. And literally the counties check that signature. So it's not just like a thing where then it disappears. They do, that is a fail-safe, because it is really hard to fake that, right? To fake somebody else's signature. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's hard to do that. The other thing is on the voter registration form, I think you asked about non-citizens. So it was before your time as senator, but you probably heard about the issues that happened before I started here in late 2017. It came to light that there was a process in place for the PennDOT system where it showed the "would you like to register to vote" screen even to people who had checked the box that said that they were not citizens. So as soon as that was identified, that was fixed. That was fixed within months in late 2017. I think that helps hugely because that's the largest pool of voter registrations. But also the voter registration form, I looked a couple of months ago, no fewer than 4 times it specifically says that you have to affirm your eligibility to vote, including citizenship. And twice, and again, on this one page, it tells the jail time and fines that you're subject to because you're asserting this under penalty of law. And there's significant fines and significant jail time. So we should be enforcing those. We put them on the books for a reason. People need to be prosecuted if there's any question. And that means that there needs to be consciousness from the local election officials to do that. But there are processes in place. All of these things combined do really help with the overall picture. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, Senator Mastriano. One last question. If you're confirmed as Secretary of State, you've already begun attending meetings with your counterparts from all across the nation. There's going to be issues where there's broad agreement among secretaries of state from the other states, and then there are going to be issues where there's no agreement or even disagreement. Can you talk about what principles will guide you in determining where you may agree or disagree with your colleagues from across the country?
That's a great question. Thank you. And I have to say, it's been really enlightening and eye-opening to work with secretaries across the country. The National Association for Secretaries of State, little known fact, is the oldest bipartisan organization for elected officials in the country. And they take it very seriously. And it was actually, so when I came in, as you might imagine, and actually most secretaries of state across the country are elected. So we're one of the few places where it's appointed, which makes me by nature, just how it's done, it's much more political when you're elected. And so that's been very interesting to see, and seeing when people, there were a number of other new folks coming in when I was coming in, and seeing the different ways the people who have been there for a while understand what it means to be collaborative and bipartisan, and some of the newer ones who have just come off of the trail, not so much. And frankly, I think that that's one of the reasons why NASS asked me to serve as co-chair, is because from the get-go, I was clear about the fact that we're exactly what you said. There's going to be a lot we're not going to agree about, and that's whether it's the national level, that's whether it's the state level. But where we can, it matters, and we should be working to find bipartisan compromise and learning, and even where we can't agree on, say, a strategy going forward, we could be learning from each other about past errors, past things we wish we had done differently, past successes. So one of the things actually, and actually I have to give credit to Gene Barr from the Chamber of Commerce for giving me this idea. He talked about that at some of their, like, I think they have biannual meetings, and he said they often talk, everybody shares sort of like a pass-fail, something to learn from a mistake about, because we all, and some sharing of successes as well. And so I talked with my co-chair from West Virginia at NAS about that I think we have a lot, whether you agree or disagree about plans forward, we could learn so much from each other about the experiences, good, bad, or ugly. So that's really, and not only that, but, as co-chair, I'm also on this, the EISGCC, the Election Infrastructure Subsector Government Coordinating Council, which it's really hard to say that 5 times fast. So we're working with federal, state, and local election officials on election security, and that's same kind of thing. Like, no way we're going to have 100% agreement, but there's so much we can learn from each other, and that's really what I'd like to do. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I thank you very much. So, again, thank you for being here this morning, for answering so many of our questions. I want to thank your staff for the constant communication throughout this entire process, and believe that no matter who is determined to sit as the chair of this committee going forward, that line of communication being open after this week to resolve our issues and work to move the Commonwealth forward is very, very important. We've got almost half of the counties in this Commonwealth moving to new voting machines next year, and I think it really is going to require an all-hands-on-deck approach to ensure that next year's election does not disenfranchise any voter, that we address the issues of long lines and lack of privacy and all the other issues that we saw in York County earlier this month. And please know, I don't place blame solely on anyone. I think there's all things that we could all do better to move forward. Now that we know what those problems are and we have those finite election dates approaching us, I want to make sure that we fix the problems for the people of this Commonwealth. So, again, thank you. And with that said, I would like to make a motion to report out with no recommendation the nomination of Kathy Boockvar as Secretary of the Commonwealth. And do I have a second? Second. Thank you, Chairman. Michael, could you please call the roll?
Senator Phillips-Hill?
Aye.
Senator Collette? Aye. Senator Corman?
Proxy aye.
Senator Gordner? Aye. Senator Mastriano?
Aye.
Senator Muth?
Proxy aye.
Senator Stefano?
Proxy aye.
Senator Judy Ward?
Proxy aye.
Senator Anthony Williams?
Aye.
Senator Lindsey Williams? Aye. And Senator Scarnati?
Proxy aye. With a majority vote, the nomination is now reported out with no recommendation, and that concludes today's agenda, and the committee stands in recess until the call of the chair. Thank you.